Okay, last week we started discussing. We stopped at about I think it was the second or third point on our in our book discussing marriage, divorce, and remarriage. One of the points that Kyle brings out is about Paul's teaching, what Paul wrote about marriage and divorce, in addition to what Jesus said as is recorded in the Gospels. And wanted to take a couple of minutes before we get back, and we're going to spend this class, hopefully, discussing a couple of things that come up in discussions with people, and even sometimes members of the church that may have been taught a certain thing about marriage and divorce. Sometimes you'll hear a phrase, still married in God's eyes, quote unquote, and that sometimes is a phrase that you'll hear in relation to mental divorce. And that's why we want to understand these terms and understand what the scriptures speak about fornication and adultery and marriage, to be able to make sure we're aware of what the gospel says, to make sure we can kind of identify when somebody says something that may not be according to what the scriptures say. So we talked about fornication last Wednesday night. We started talking about adultery as well. We talked about Romans chapter 7. And we discussed how that Paul was making the point actually about the Jewish brethren being, quote unquote, divorced from the law of Moses in order to be married to the law of Christ. And the idea there is that they were in a covenant relationship through Moses to God. How can we now be bound to Christ and his covenant if we're still bound to the covenant of Moses? And Paul uses the example of God's law regarding marriage and the binding of law to describe how that a woman, as long as her husband's alive, if she divorces that husband and marries another man, she shall be called an adulteress. Well, it's not that she's still married to the first man. Paul specifically says she marries another man, but she's still bound by the law to that first man. Therefore, that's why she's called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, then she's free to remarry. And if she remarries someone, or if she marries someone, not remarries, but she marries someone else, now that her husband has passed away, is she an adulteress? No, because she's been freed from that law. And Paul makes the case, verse 4 and 5, that you have died to the law of Moses. In essence, they are the husband in that situation, and now you've been basically raised to be married to another, is the idea there. You have died to the law of Moses. God, Jesus, has put that away. And now you are basically new, and the law is, you're free from the law of Moses to be married to the law of Christ, to be in a covenant relationship with the law of Christ. So that's the whole point that he uses there in Romans chapter 7. And he uses, and that's why he says, I speak to those who know the law. He's not talking about the Roman law. He's not talking about the law of Moses. He's talking about the law of Christ. I'm using this example within what God's law is regarding marriage and divorce to make this point about the spiritual application of being connected to the law of Christ. So as we talked about adultery and fornication, these are two different terms, two different ideas. As we mentioned, fornication or porneia, which is translated sexual immorality, it can include adultery. And there's a couple of places, and we even mentioned here how that Vines in Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9, it stands for and includes adultery. And that's why in those particular texts regarding those who commit that sin, it's for that exception that the spouse that didn't commit adultery can put that spouse who is guilty away and then be free to remarry. But so the term fornication is a broad sense, but it is still specific to the sexual act. And that's the key component to remember there. Adultery is more specific. It speaks directly to unlawful intercourse with the spouse of another. That's very specific. And we see this in Matthew 5:19, the parallel in Mark chapter 7, Galatians 5:19, in these lists of sins that are listed here. Like in Matthew 5, Jesus mentions that from the heart proceed evil thoughts. And then after evil thoughts, he has this list. And adultery and fornication are listed separately there, though he's specific about both of those in that context. In Galatians 5:19, adultery is listed as works of the flesh in contrast to the fruit of the Spirit. In John chapter 8 and in verse 3, remember how there was a woman who was caught in the act of adultery. She was brought before Jesus, and they were trying to test Jesus. The Jews were saying that the law of Moses says we're to stone her. Okay? Well, did the law of Moses say that? Yeah, it did. It did say that. But who else was supposed to be stoned? The man. It almost, it sounds very sketchy, to be honest. That the whole situation sounds very sketchy, that she happened to be caught in the act of, and yet the man's not there. It's almost like a reverse kind of honey trap type of situation. It's like they designed this situation specifically in order to entrap her, to then bring her to Jesus to try to trap Jesus. It's almost what it sounds like. We don't know that for a fact, but it seems awfully convenient that she happened to be caught. But that was specific to the act of adultery. So either this woman was married, or the man, and more likely so, the man was. But regardless, maybe they both were. Either way, it's specific to adultery here. This is not just fornication, this is adultery. And of course, Jesus in that text, did he absolve that woman of any sin? She didn't do anything wrong? What did he tell her to do? Go and sin no more. So he acknowledged she did sin. Now he's telling her, don't do that anymore. Then Matthew 5, Matthew 19, Mark 10, Luke chapter 16, in the teachings that, as Kyle pointed out, regarding Jesus and the discussions he made or had about those who are married and the exception for divorce, which is the exception is only found in 2 instances of those 4. This is the sin that one commits who marries someone who is divorced. And as a result, they commit adultery. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 and 28. And this is a very crucial text to remember, because this is perhaps one of the, especially as we're going to talk about here in just a minute, one of the teachings that's going around in the church today has to deal with embracing other broad definitions for sexual immorality. And what Jesus says, and I can't talk and do stuff at the same time. Matthew 5, 27. Starting in verse 27, you have heard it was said to the ancients, or you have heard it was said of old. I'm reading from a literal translation. New King James, verse 27. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And so this is a crucial verse. So what Jesus says is, can I sin even in my thoughts? Yes. Okay. In fact, isn't covetousness, isn't that a sin of the heart as well? Okay. You don't even necessarily have to do anything as far as covetousness. It's just that overwhelming desire for this house or this job or this money or whatever it may be. Well, lust works the same way. I can sin in my mind, in my heart. It's not just with my body. And this is part of what Jesus is describing, because part of what the law acknowledged, and even, and really, I mean, and I would contend that the old law, it was implied that you weren't supposed to look upon a woman like that anyway. But the way the Jews read it, I say the Jews, the majority of them, the way they read it the way they did was kind of checklist, boom, 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 was I can look and desire a person as long as I don't actually do that sin, commit that sin. And yet, Jesus says, that's not okay. You can't just look on someone as long as you don't do the actual sin, then you're all right. That's not how that works. And I would suggest that there's plenty in the Old Testament, the Mosaical law, to say that that was implied, that there was, having one's heart pure, one's heart being upright. Okay, certainly I wouldn't consider having lust in my heart being upright and pure. So there's plenty of implication there that even under the old law this wasn't allowed. But Jesus says he's very specific about it and brings up a specific scenario here. Now, that being the case, as I said, there are individuals who are teaching, and I'm aware of at least 2 situations where the concept of, and it's not just limited to pornography either, but in both cases I'm aware of, this is one of the reasons that is mentioned, that because the term porneia includes the word porn, therefore pornography is also a cause for divorce. And they base that from Matthew 5, 27 and 28. Because the term there, and as we mentioned, the concept of adultery is moikos. Okay, it is that term. That's the term specifically being mentioned. This is adultery. But then because they link it to sexual immorality, they say this therefore fits the same idea, and therefore that's a reason for divorce. And sometimes a false, well, and ultimately the argument is a false equivalency, because there was even a Facebook post, and the preacher who was making this argument posted it almost like a meme, but what he said was, is looking at porn sexually moral? Well, of course, no, it's not. Well, if you can't say it is, then it's sexual immorality, and he was using that as a statement, and then he linked to Matthew 19:9, that sexual immorality is cause for divorce. But that's a false equivalency, because what you're saying is that means that the term sexual immorality has to include that which is pornography and not just porneia. And when the term porneia is used, this is the actual physical act, not just the depiction of it, the pictures or writing of it. It's the actual physical act being involved. Now, that's not to say that pornography is okay. It's not. But it is not what Jesus describes as being cause for divorce. And in Matthew 15:19, I think is a very important component to this, because remember, we already mentioned Matthew 15:19, but remember what Jesus said about evil thoughts. Well, here's a very crucial component of this. Out of the heart proceeds evil thoughts. Now, would lust be included in evil thoughts? Sure. Covetousness, would that be evil thoughts? Sure. Wishing ill will upon someone, would that be evil thoughts? Absolutely. Out of the heart proceeds evil thoughts, and then he continues to say murders, adulteries, fornications. He specifically says and mentions adulteries and fornications separate from evil thoughts, which means that Jesus is defining these things according to their actual definition of being physical acts. Whereas when Jesus in Matthew 5 refers to the lust of the heart, where are they committing that adultery? In the heart, not in the flesh. It's not a physical act they're committing. It's a mental act. It's a lust of the heart. That's why Jesus specifies that he's committed adultery in his heart. That's why Jesus specifies that, because the term Jesus uses is a physical act, but he uses it in the heart to specify that he's not using that definition in a physical way. Now, that being the case, we need to remember that there's another component to this as well, because what happens is, and this is applied often to pornography, but I want you to consider other ways or other situations where something like this could come up. I'm going to say you go to the beach. Okay, usually, when my family goes, we try to find an isolated place where there's not many people around. But you go to the beach, and do people of the world dress modestly there? Now, what if a wife were just to assume that you're out there at the beach and a woman walks by, and my husband had evil thoughts in his mind, I'm going to divorce him? Well, how do you know that? Now, I'm not in any way making the argument, well, pornography, well, maybe that person doesn't have lust in their heart. No, obviously they would. But my point is that we judge actions, we can judge words, but do we have the authority to judge hearts? Even if we're pretty sure we know what's in their heart, do we have that authority? No. Only God's word, Hebrews chapter 4, it's able to discern the thoughts and intents of the heart. That's what God's judgment does. We can't do that. Again, we judge based on actions and words. And we can make some applications as to motivation and things like that, but we cannot make a judgment like that of sin within somebody's mind or heart, because we're not in their mind and heart. And commercials. Okay, sitting watching a TV show, and we all know these commercials that pop up, especially nowadays. Of course, I say commercials. My kids have no idea what commercials are. Are you talking about ads? Yes, ads. Okay, these ads pop up, and are there sometimes people immodestly dressed in these ads? Yeah. Some of these are extremely not child-friendly at all. And so can a wife just assume there's some kind of ad that comes on where a woman is dressed immodestly because she can just assume her husband lusted, and so I'm going to divorce him? See, as much as people, and when you put it in those terms, people are like, oh, no, that's silly. But pornography, there's no doubt. But it's still the same issue. You're talking about judging a heart, not knowing what's in their heart. You may know what's in their heart based on the context, but it's about judging that heart. We can't do that. And Matthew 5:21 through 22, remember what Jesus said. He didn't just limit this from evil thoughts come adulteries and fornications. What else does he say? Murder, theft, false witness. Now, if I fantasize about murdering somebody, is that wrong? Sure. Yeah, that's definitely wrong. Okay. But can I go to jail for committing murder because I thought about it, at least yet? No. No. Okay. So my point would be, starting verse, I think it said verse 21 and 22, but it should be verse 19 and 20. These things defile a man. To eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man. It's the actions and certainly the thoughts that then provoke the actions. But ultimately, if you're going to say that adulteries can be formed in the heart and I can therefore enact a physical judgment, which is in essence what Matthew 19:9 is by divorcing your spouse, you are making a judgment. This person has done this act that is sinful, and according to the law, I have the right to divorce them. If that's the case, then murders should also be a sin for which people should be punished in the heart. Thefts in the heart, again, that speaks to jealousies, it speaks to covetousness, false witness, and blasphemies. I mean, anything in a person's heart, therefore, should be actively and physically judged, or action should be taken against them physically for those things. Not just adultery and fornication. But then the argument would be, well, we can't know for sure what their thoughts were. That's my point. Exactly. Because you're not there. You're not in their heart and their mind. God is. Now, it doesn't take anything away from the sin. All these things are sinful in the mind and heart. But it's the physical act that Jesus defines in Matthew 19:9 as cause for divorce. I saw somebody saying, yeah, Pam. Absolutely. 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 That you're absolutely right. And murders, it's not just you, it's whoever you're murdering, right? I mean, never mind any loved ones and people who are affected, okay? Those are secondary to what we're talking about. Direct affecting is you and the person you're murdering. Adultery, the same way. Fornication, the same way. Theft, you're stealing from somebody. Somebody owns whatever it is you're stealing. False witness and blasphemies, you're absolutely right. Those all affect somebody directly. Okay, now evil thoughts, while they still are sinful, where are they contained? Within me. Okay, now if it starts to leak out and affect how I treat somebody, then the rest of these come to play. But right now it's within me. That still doesn't make it right. I'm not in any way trying to diminish the sin of evil thoughts. But that's kind of part of the point that Paul makes, as we talked about last week in 1 Corinthians 7. Don't make the mistake of including someone else in your sin. To that woman who had divorced her husband unlawfully, remain unmarried or be reconciled to your husband, or to that man to whom she's bound. The reason for that is don't include someone else now, and now somebody's been added to your sin. It's bad enough that you've done this thing. And as we talked about that term reconcile, there's two terms in the New Testament for reconcile. One is where two guilty parties come back together. The second term is where one guilty party reconciles themselves to an innocent party. And it's almost always used with regard to man reconciling themselves to God. The exception is 1 Corinthians 7, where this woman has done evil. She's left her husband, and not for adultery. And Paul is acknowledging that. You've done that which is evil, therefore you should reconcile to your husband. That's the another hand somewhere. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to use the example that you did of murder.
Yeah.
I can't be charged with murder if I only think about it. But if I hire someone to murder and money's exchanged, I can go to jail for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I took a physical action and hired someone to commit the murder. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, that's kind of like the reverse of some of these issues that we're seeing in London, for instance, in England, where people are being thrown in prison and prosecuted because they're standing around these abortion clinics, and judgments being made that they're praying because they have their eyes closed. Okay, well, that's being related to thought police, and it's a very concerning trend, to be sure. But it's kind of the reverse of that. If I'm in a store and I'm looking at a TV, and it's a really nice TV, and I'm just staring there looking at it, can a police officer arrest me for desiring to steal if I didn't actually steal?
I guess my point was that if you hire someone, you've taken physical action
Oh,
on
yeah.
your thought.
Absolutely.
So you took it from the thought into something that's gonna happen.
Absolutely.
You made something.
Absolutely. And if you hire somebody to steal something, same difference. I mean, it's the exact same thing. You're absolutely right. Yep. All right. Anything through that thought process? Because this is a very dangerous teaching that's going around that women can divorce, well, in theory, anyone, but it's been applied the two times I know about women divorcing their husbands for just having lust in their heart. And again, that doesn't make it okay, but that is not what Jesus teaches for as cause for divorce. And then there's another teaching for the sake of the kingdom. This one is going to Matthew 19, where Peter describes, or how he says, he tells Jesus, we've left all for the sake of the kingdom. We've left husbands, or we've left wives, we've left children, we've left houses, we've left properties, we've left parents. And the term we've left is the same term Jesus uses in Matthew 19:9 about tearing asunder. And I know one preacher who has made the application, well, that means Peter's talking about divorce. That means if, for the sake of the kingdom, you have to divorce your spouse, Peter says that's okay. Well, now let's be clear here. Was Peter saying that they had divorced their spouses? Did they divorce their children? Did they divorce their parents, their homes, and it wasn't just people. See, so you can't just apply it to say, well, they're contrary to you and they're making it hard for you. No, even property and houses and stuff, or things that are inanimate, are mentioned in that list. Those things didn't do anything to me to prevent me from being a Christian, but the application is made if your spouse is making it impossible for you to live as a Christian. Well, now define that. Well, that can take on a lot of forms, right? If he's just even suggesting, well, why are you going to church? Oh, you're making it impossible for me to live as a Christian. I'm going to divorce you. Well, that's the idea. If he makes it impossible, and the specific situation I'm aware of, this preacher's daughter had a husband who was drug trafficking through their home. And this preacher tried to find an excuse, a reason for his daughter to be able to get out of the situation. Now, to be fair, he claims that you can't remarry, but you can divorce. Well, in that situation, you've got a spouse who's drug trafficking through your home. What would a normal, rational person do? Call the police. Call the police. They're doing something illegal, and by the law of association, if you do nothing, what are you? An accessory. So call the police. Have them arrest. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing contrary to what a spouse is supposed to be if a person is committing a crime. Not only is it sinful what he was doing, sure it was sinful, but he's committing an actual physical crime, then he needs to suffer the consequences for it. And that applies to abusive spouses. You know, that question has been brought up, and there was a preacher one time who described it to me this way. He said, you know, people have asked me about abusive spouses. Well, how dare you say that I can't divorce my spouse because they're abusing me? Well, fortunately, in our country, there are laws, and in most countries, there are laws about that. But he used this analogy. He said, it's kind of like there's a logger cutting down a tree in the forest, and you're standing there, and you can very well tell that tree's about to follow him. Okay. Well, you can run back, you can run side to side, but does that give you the right to shoot the logger? And that's what he likened it to. He's like, okay, you can get out of that situation. You have avenues to be able to get out of that scenario. That doesn't mean you get to take it out on the individual who's doing this, whether it's shooting them in this analogy or divorcing them contrary to the law of God. And that's a key component to that as well. There are other avenues. Divorce isn't one of them. And that's very difficult, especially in our modern times, to hear that, because it's not, a lot of people consider it not fair. That's not fair, especially given the kind of power dynamic between husbands and wives. You're absolutely right. That's not fair that individual is abusing that position of authority. You're right, that's not fair. It's not God's word that's not fair. It's that individual who's not fair. But having said that, what did Paul tell those who were bondservants? Even to those masters who were not Christians, how were those bondservants to act? You are to serve them as if you serve Christ. Okay? Not all of those masters of those slaves and bondservants were kind people. But did Paul say it's okay for you to run away? No, he didn't. And that's a very difficult thing, especially in our modern time, to kind of wrap our head around. That is not an easy thing to kind of understand and appreciate. In fact, when Paul wrote to Philemon, you remember he sent Onesiphorus back to Philemon. Onesimus or Onesiphorus? Was it Onesimus? He sent Onesimus back to Philemon. But Onesimus had become a Christian. He's now a brother. But technically, he was owned by Philemon. Did Paul write to Philemon and say, well, now he's a brother, you need to let him go? Or did he say, Philemon, it's how dare you have bondservants, whether they were slaves or whether they were indentured servants because they owed a debt, whatever it was. Did Paul say that to Philemon? He did not. He said, receive him back not only as a slave, but as a brother. And I think that's really interesting that Paul said that. And that goes to speak to the gospel is about our spiritual state. Does it have anything to do with the physical responsibilities or physical binding states that we're in? Just because I become a Christian, does that mean I should be let loose from prison if I killed somebody? But I become a Christian. That means my sin's been washed away, right? But has my consequence been washed away? No. And whether I'm an indentured servant or a slave and it has nothing I've done that to deserve that situation, becoming a Christian doesn't change that situation. And that speaks as well to another teaching that was very prevalent. Homer Haley was kind of the one who wrote about it and taught it, but the idea of those who are divorced and remarried and then come to Christ. Okay, he taught that those who are divorced and married could be divorced and married 10 times, doesn't matter. Once you're washed in baptism, all those past relationships get washed away. That's like saying, if I am a thief of fine cars, beautiful classic cars, and I've got a collection of 10 classic cars, and they're gorgeous, and then I become a Christian, I get to keep the cars, right? What does it mean to become a Christian? What is one of the steps of becoming a Christian? Repentance. What does repentance mean? To turn around, to make right what I've done. In order to become a Christian, do those vehicles belong to me? Did they belong to me when I took them?
Oh, no, I didn't hear the stolen part.
Yeah, no, I stole them. I took them.
No, you gotta give it back.
Yeah, I got to give them back. Okay, I have to confess what I've done and take responsibility for those actions. They don't just all of a sudden, the ownership, because I've become a Christian, the ownership of those vehicles now reverts to me because now I'm a Christian. My sins for stealing them have been washed away. And that's true, my sin of stealing them has been washed away. But do I have any right to them? No. And that exactly same concept applies with married and divorced. I have no right to this spouse, or I have no right to remarry, even if I've become a Christian. That doesn't remove the binding of law. That still applies. Yes, ma'am.
I heard in a sermon one time, a preacher gave the example of a real couple that both of them were divorced, they both got married. I mean, they got married to each other. They obeyed the gospel. They'd been together for a long time, and they heard a lesson about marriage, divorce, and marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And they both realized that they didn't have the right to be married. And because they were both Christians, I don't know if they divorced, but they don't live together. I'm sure they probably divorced. But he lives like across north to south.
I think you probably heard that from me, actually, because I brought that one up. One of my best friends, that's his parent situation. Absolutely. And they did divorce because they had no right to be married.
They're still friends.
And what they said was, they sat down, they studied it, and what they said, and I'll never forget what they said. They said, either we go to heaven separate, or we go to hell together. That's what they said. That's what they realized. And that is just, when you think about what that meant, And the fact that they had two little boys, I mean, they weren't even teenagers yet. The one was 12, one was 10, I think, at the time. I mean, that's unbelievable.
And
They had a good marriage. They loved each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yet they made that decision because they recognized what God's law says. 99 times out of 100, though, what's going to jump in the place of Scripture? Emotion. Well, yeah, it says this, but is God really going to send us to hell because we love each other? Well, you could say that about homosexuality too, couldn't you? Love is love. Well, can God really send us to hell because we love each other? Or adultery, or fornication? We love each other. Well, what difference does it make? God, love conquers all, right? Does God ever say that goes back to the point of being obedient, of doing what God says? You can't, and if you get to pick and choose what you're going to do with what God says, then what's the point? I'll do some of what God says, but not other parts of what God says? Does God ever allow that among his people? You're guilty of one, you're guilty of all. Okay, you are a transgressor of the law. And that demands not only you need to seek forgiveness, but before I get to the forgiveness part, what do I have to do? Repent. Repent. I have to put it away. Yeah. All right, any thoughts through that? All right. So real quickly, I'm not going to go through all of this, but I wanted to kind of point out this other aspect of, there we go. This other aspect of what's called mental divorce. And the reason why we make such a distinction between being bound and being married, okay? There's a really important reason why we make that distinction. In a scriptural marriage, you have a husband and a wife, okay? Once they say I do, and they're pronounced husband and wife, the law of God, we just started. The law of God binds the husband to the wife and the wife to the husband. Okay? In addition, you've got the marriage relationship. This is the husband and wife part, and the binding of all that means. That includes the aspects of taking care of each other and helping each other get to heaven. All of that is the marriage relationship. Now, that being the case, this is separate from the binding of God's law. Paul makes a differentiation in Romans 7. This woman married another man, and yet she was still bound by law to the first one. Now, people try to argue, well, that's just accommodative speech. Okay, that phrase sometimes gets tossed around. I don't think they know what it means. Accommodative speech, if that's true, that means that Jesus lied when he said what he said. Using accommodative speech regarding this woman who marries another, or he who marries her who is divorced. Well, you can't marry her. She's married to the first husband. So why did Jesus say marry? Paul does the same thing. It's the exact same throughout all the teachings regarding marriage and divorce. And I suggest it's an accommodative speech. There is the binding law, and then there's the marriage relationship. The marriage relationship could be considered the physical and emotional joining of the husband and the wife. That's acknowledged by God. But then there's the binding of God's law, which is the spiritual joining. Because when two people divorce, does that mean God doesn't see it if it's not for adultery? Because that's what people argue. Well, they're still married in God's eyes. Really? They got divorced. Jesus even refers to people who divorce. We would have to say that what Jesus is actually saying, that the man who divorces his spouse and marries another commits adultery, well, not really divorce and not really married. Just only in man's eyes. And you have to make all of these little modifiers. Well, this is in man's eyes, and this is in God's eyes, and God doesn't see the divorce. Well, if God doesn't see the divorce, how can a sin take place? I mean, what's the commandment in 1 Corinthians 7? The wife is not to do what? Not to divorce her husband. The husband's not to do what? Divorce his wife. What happens if I break a commandment? I sin. And in every other example in the New Testament of a sin being made, we know 1 John chapter 3, what is sin? It is the transgression of the commandments of God, right? But why is it then for this one scenario, this one situation, that if two people get divorced who don't have a right to be divorced, God doesn't see that? It didn't actually happen. Well, then somebody who was arguing for mental divorce corrected me. They said, well, no, God sees it. He just doesn't acknowledge it. So yeah, you got divorced in man's eyes. But as far as God's concerned, yeah, you did that thing. You think you got divorced, but you're really not. I still consider you married. Yet Jesus and Paul say, no, they're divorced. And then they remarried or married another. They use those terms for a reason. We have a situation where wife commits sexual immorality. Okay? The husband divorces her. So she's now the ex-wife. She is unmarried, 1 Corinthians 7, verse 11, although that's not the situation that existed there of adultery taking place. That Paul's not suggesting that in that verse. But the idea is she has been divorced from her husband. She's unmarried. Not just alone, not still married in God's eyes. She is unmarried. Now the husband, he is able to lawfully remarry. So he divorces his spouse. He's able to remarry this wife. Now they are bound to one another. They have this relationship. But this woman, if she remarries, what sin does she commit? Adultery. Jesus says it's adultery. But she's not married. How can it be adultery if she's not married? She's still bound. She is still bound by the law of God to that man as long as he lives. That's Romans 7. And the component to that is that's why it's adultery. And I was speaking to somebody one time, this was years ago, and they said, no, it's not adultery because they're still bound. It's adultery because Jesus has called it adultery. He just used that word. That would basically mean that no words ever spoken in the Bible mean anything according to their definition. Basically what he was trying to say is that Jesus just used a word for the fun of it. He just used the term adultery for the sake of using adultery. He didn't actually mean adultery. And I don't believe that for a second. I think Jesus meant adultery. What sin is she committing? Is she sinning against this man? They're divorced. He put her away. If she remarries, is she committing adultery against him? No. So who's she committing adultery against? Against God. Because she's still bound by law. And as a result, she's committing adultery, and including this other individual, this man, with her in that sin. All right, we will stop there. We'll finish up with this mental divorce not next Wednesday night. Whichever Wednesday night is going to be first Wednesday of January. We'll finish up with this, and then we'll get back to our book and finish up that. Thank you, everybody. Also, there were no more outlines or copies of this adultery, fornication, all that stuff that I did up last Wednesday. So I printed some more if anybody wants some extra copies.